guest speaker today is Dr. Michael Masters. He's a professor of biological anthropology at Montana Technological University in Butte, Montana. His current research program centers on hominin evolutionary anatomy, human variation, archaeology, biomedicine, and investigating the UFO phenomenon. Regarding the latter, in 2019, he published Identifying Flying Objects, a multidisciplinary scientific approach to the UFO phenomenon, which examines the premise that UFOs and aliens may be our human descendants, returning from the future to visit and study their own hominin evolutionary past. In 2022, he published The Extraterrestrial Model, which analyzes well-documented cases of abduction and other contact modalities in the context of this time travel hypothesis, and other theories put forth to elucidate this complex and mysterious phenomenon. His forthcoming 2023 book, Revelation, The Future Human Past, again focuses on UFOs in the framework of this extraterrestrial model, but in the format of a satirical time travel science fiction novel. Please welcome Dr. Michael Masters.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out today, and thank you for having me, Stacy and Shane, and everyone else involved in putting this on. I gotta admit, Phoenix is one of my favorite places to come to talk. It seems everyone here is really open-minded, and obviously you have a good reason to be interested in the phenomenon with the Phoenix Lights, which is a pretty monumental case in the history of UFOs. In that context, as Stacy pointed out, I was hoping to sort of explore some other things that have kind of been ruminating on in the context of this phenomenon more recently, how this time travel model might apply to other interpretations of what's going on with regard to the origins and intent of these beings seen in association with the craft, but still sort of trying to maintain this idea where we try not to interject too many assumptions, sort of sticking with this Occam's razor approach, the principle of parsimony, where you have the fewest assumptions. You're trying to just look at what we know, look across different cases, look across different abductee and contactee accounts, and see what we might parse out of those without interjecting too many assumptions built on top of that. And it is important to consider all models. I've obviously been advocating for this time travel theory, which has been around for quite some time. The early mid-40s is about the earliest I've been able to track it to. And it's been talked about, it's been tossed around. I think there's a lot of things that do help explain some aspects of the phenomenon, but I certainly don't claim that this accounts for everything. We need to consider all models and all accounts in trying to figure out what might be taking place. With that said, I sort of would like to echo, I don't know how many of you got a chance to read Hal Puthoff's paper about the ultra-terrestrials. I'll talk about it here in a second. But one of his main points is that it's important to look at everything, but as more evidence presents itself, and evidence in the context of this phenomenon is obviously somewhat different than how we conceptualize the standards of evidence in a scientific capacity, but as more information does come to light, that may allow us to start whittling down various interpretations and hopefully be left with one that is the correct one at some point in what could potentially be the near future. And another important question related to this, which is the focus of the symposium, the MUFON symposium in Cincinnati in late August, is are they friendly or are they not friendly? Are they friend or foe? Are they our enemies? Or should we look at the abduction aspects of this, the interactions we have with these craft and the beings that pilot them, as friendly occasions, or are they doing things to us that could be considered unfriendly, which is certainly the case. I'm not going to talk about that too much here. That's more the focus of the symposium, but I do feel that it's important to at least raise that question here because it's innately tied to the question of who they are and what they're doing, what their origins are, and what their intent is here on this planet or in this time or various times throughout our collective past, if they do happen to be future human time travelers. So that's kind of the main focus of this, and I'll touch on some things we talk about today a little bit in that MUFON symposium in Cincinnati, but it's going to focus more on the friend or foe question. I also, because you are all knowledgeable, open-minded people here in the Phoenix community, wanted to sort of bounce some ideas around that I've been thinking about lately that sort of stem from that paper that Hal Puthoff published I think it was around the summer of last year. I don't remember exactly when it came out, but he titled it Ultra-Terrestrial Models, and he's certainly someone who's been around for a while and has had his finger in many pies or whatever that metaphor is. I'm really bad with metaphors. And I think he did a good job laying out some of the different models and again really highlighted the fact that we should be looking at all of them and others, but sort of whittling them down as more information comes to pass. And so his main abstract in this paper, two seminal statements and their concomitants currently unknown as follows. I think we can all agree with this one. We wouldn't be here, we wouldn't be following this, talking about this if we didn't. There is an unidentified phenomenon interacting with the current human population on Earth. That seems like a no-brainer at this point, and it's great to see more people coming around to this, even mainstream media, different government organizations, scientists, my colleagues. It's really great to see more and more taking it seriously and really opening up to this possibility and the reality of this phenomenon. And then this was the other main crux of the paper. It is currently unknown whether the phenomenon is exclusively extraterrestrial, extra-dimensional, crypto-terrestrial, demonic, jinn, proto-ancient human, time travelers, etc. And the thing I want to focus on today is the last part of this, or some combination or mutation of any or all of these. Because the more I've looked into this, the more I've started to think, what if it is all of them? And how could that be? How could it be all of these with something of a common origin, or at least limited origins, possibly a couple different things going on? So I sort of want to jump into that a little bit. That aspect of this is how Puthoff articulated it. But also, what if the common thread that ties all of these different models together is time? Not necessarily just future humans per se, but what if we look at all of these different models, which have kind of become the main established ways of interpreting this phenomenon, in the context of time, how time might relate to these? Shane, you lied to me. This thing doesn't work. You know I'm a walker, man. I like to move around. Maybe I just need to turn it on. I probably just needed to turn it on.
No, you know what needs to happen? The dumb IT guy needs to plug it in.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Sorry.
No worries. So, yeah, like I said, I don't claim to proclaim a truth. I don't know what's going on. Nobody does at this current time. But I do think it's important to sort of challenge the way we all think about this. I've certainly been challenging the way I've conceptualized this and have modified my understanding and my way of thinking about this and talking about this with people, largely because of exactly this, talking with people. I'll be the first to admit that when I published my first book in 2019, despite studying this phenomenon my entire life, I had a very myopic view of what was going on. And I think it's important for all of us to sort of stop and reflect on that as more information comes to light, but also as we evolve as people, as we evolve as individuals and start to get more information that we didn't have previously. So today's talk is kind of that idea in a nutshell, is sort of trying to understand what we can about their physiology, their technology, behaviors, what we can know about causality across different periods of time, and then, again, origins and intent, which I do think is at the heart of this. So that'll kind of be the main jumping off point for this talk today. Paul Hynek is obviously a very well-known individual, a great guy. And one of his favorite quotes of mine, he was asked about this extra tempestrial model, as I call it, this time travel model, and he said, I think it makes sense because we have to ask, how would they find us and why would they care? And I think that's important. You can make the case that any extraterrestrial, highly advanced life form with the technology that we see could travel across the cosmos. I don't think that we have to worry about limitations in space because these craft can seemingly move extremely fast. But there is the question of how they would find us. We've only been radiating signals from the Earth for, I think, 70 years or so, at least in a meaningful context. And there are other issues with the extraterrestrial hypothesis, many of which I point out in my first book. If we do have a separate evolution on another planet, if it's entirely separate from what happened here, it's not likely that we would get upright walking hominin beings that look and act so much like ourselves, and we'll jump back into that later. But in the context of their origins and intent, we also might expect that if they are coming here, what would they be doing? And that's sort of been the premise of a lot of science fiction movies and TV shows throughout really the history of film, is that they would come here and kill us, enslave us. I remember one of my friends, when my first book came out, and he read it, and he said, my entire life I'd worried about an alien invasion. And I read this, and he made a case that, maybe they're us. And if they are, why would they come back and kill us all? It doesn't make any sense. It's like the grandfather paradox writ large. Enslaving us, forcing us into labor camps, taking our resources, or even if they were friendly and they schlepped all across the universe to get here, we might expect them to at least announce their presence. And that seems to be the opposite of what's taking place, where they're clearly here and have been for tens of thousands of years, but they go out of their way to overtly announce their presence. And then another thing that we necessarily wouldn't expect, and obviously, these are just speculating about what an extraterrestrial race might do here, we can never know, but given the fact that they have their own planet, they had their own evolution, they're entirely separate from us, we wouldn't necessarily expect them to care so deeply about this planet. That is something we might expect from individuals who inherit this planet, who live here after us, who would want us to take care of it because they have to live here after we're done with it and they get to that point where it becomes theirs. So in the context of Paul Hynek's quote, how would they find us, why would they care, this very common message that's given to contactees and abductees. It's so ubiquitous across all of these various cases. In my second book, I pulled this quote from Steve Mera, a well-known ufologist in the UK, who says, if we look at these so-called messages from ET over the years, it's always been the same one-liner: look after planet Earth. They say it to the kids in the schools. You have an example in Wales. You have the Ariel School encounter where that was very articulated as well. They say it to contactees. They say it all around the world. Look after the Earth. We're ruining the Earth. It's never about us, though. It's like, look after yourselves. I don't think they care much about us, to be honest with you. There are people out there who've been responsible for killing mass humans, and it's never been stopped. It's never been intervened. It's like, do what you want. You're all a pack of mad dogs, but look after planet Earth. There's something about planet Earth they're interested in. So again, in the context of origins, why would they care? Why would they care about this planet unless they had a vested interest in it, unless they were stakeholders in the future of this planet? John Mack also was very aware of how commonly this message is conveyed. It's a tragedy that he's not around to see all of the things happening today, many of which are in part because of his efforts in researching this phenomenon and working closely with contactees and abductees. But he's quoted as saying in Passport to the Cosmos, I was astonished to discover that in case after case, powerful messages about the human threat to Earth's ecology were being conveyed to the experiencers in vivid, unmistakable words and images. The impact of these communications is often profound. Indeed, it seems to me quite possible that the protection of the Earth's life is at the heart of the abduction phenomenon. Another case that many people aren't familiar with that I think is really important to factor in to this whole question of origin and intent is one of Mike and Leo Dworshak, two young immigrant boys who lived in South Dakota, I believe. I highlight their case in my second book, The Extratempestrial Model. But they noticed a trend where these very human-looking beings who spoke 500 languages, looked exactly like us, did jumping jacks outside their craft, wore the one-piece jumpsuit, coverall type garments that are often described in these cases, even told them explicitly that they kept coming back to that same spot. Asked about that, they replied that they were studying life patterns in that valley, and they would continue monitoring it and other places as our world gets deeper into trouble. And that's interesting because we have seen that happening. It's undeniable that things have been happening to this planet because of our existence, our sheer numbers, sort of tragedy of the commons on a global scale. So again, why would they care? But also, how would they know the future unless they are coming from that future? And there were a number of instances of things that were said like this, where they would know about Leo's future. They talked about the future in that region. They talked about the future of the human race. How do you have that clairvoyance? How do you have that future knowledge unless you do actually know what's going to happen? And why monitor it? Why pay attention to the details of these specific environmental changes in specific places unless it does have some bearing on their own existence? I mentioned briefly the Zimbabwe case, the Ariel School. Sarah was a witness to that who was interviewed later and reflected on the telepathic message some of them received about environmental change, rapid technological evolution, stating they weren't wrong, though, about the environmental shit, were they? If you go out there now, you'll see the Miombo forests have disappeared for firewood, and you can see this all over Africa. I've lived and worked in South Africa, a number of different places, and we actually had one of the only old-growth forests that remained in the entire country of South Africa in our backyard. And you'd go from the bush into this old-growth forest, and it was amazing. The transition in the biosphere, the life, the trees, everything about it was fundamentally different. Moreover, one of the original Ariel School investigators later stated, "It haunts me to this day that what the kids said about how we are destroying the environment is coming to pass." And here we're only talking about 30 years. Obviously, since the Industrial Revolution, it's been happening on a broad scale. I didn't bring this up just to harp on the fact that we're destroying the planet, but that they care about the planet, and they're aware of it. And why would they care? I think we should all be asking that question. Why would they care, especially if they're extraterrestrials? Why would they care if they're extratempestrials? And they do inherit this planet. I made a very crude analogy in one of my books about a porta potty at a music festival or something, and my editor had me take that out because it was a crude poop reference, I guess. But you get the idea. If you've been to music festivals, you know that you don't want to be the one using that on a Sunday afternoon in the hot sun. So I think it also can help us conceptualize just why they're so focused on nukes, too. And this has been something that has been reported on, studied, described in a number of different cases. And there's also a temporal correlate. If we look at when the UFO phenomenon really started to ramp up, I don't know, it may be a coincidence, but it happened to be right around the same time, post-World War II, Manhattan Project, where we start to develop and use and test nuclear weapons. Which definitely, if you were future humans or arguably extraterrestrials, that signals a marked change in our technological evolution. And one that's important. We've been killing each other since the dawn of time. The successful groups, the ones that are better at killing them, take over those lands, and they take their technology that allowed them to kill and conquer those lands with them. And that's, not really a big deal in the context of global human society, the fate of our species. You can only do so much damage with a copper-tipped arrow or a spear or even gunpowder stuffed into an iron barrel. But once you start talking about thermonuclear weapons, now it's not just about mass killing of humans, it's also about the destruction of the biome, of ecology, of the environment. And you can see why people who have to live in this environment later might be concerned about a bunch of drunk monkeys juggling chainsaws is probably how they see us. They have also demonstrated not only an interest in what we're doing with them, but have shown that they can shut them down. We see in Malmstrom Air Force Base, Mino Air Force Base in South Dakota, North Dakota, one of the Dakotas. Malmstrom is interesting. I got to give a talk there in 2019, soon after my book came out. They invited me up because, much like Phoenix with the Phoenix Lights, because of that Malmstrom event, people were forced to pay attention. And they're incredibly open-minded and interested in this phenomenon. It was a great talk. I got to meet and interact with a lot of amazing people who were directly involved in that, who had stories. A friend of mine in Butte actually was hired to convert all of the digital equipment to analog because of that event. I guess they assumed they couldn't shut down analog equipment and digital was too easy. I don't know exactly what the logic is there, but he was hired to do that. And then obviously all of the messages that are given to contactees and abductees, warning of the dangers of war, the dangers of these nuclear weapons, and the ecological damage that they can do. So I think it's important to consider that. Ooh, that's a long one. I think this is my last quote. If you don't like listening to me read, I certainly don't like reading these, so it's good for me. Mack was also struck by how common it was for experiencers to continue having some form of contact throughout their lives, and the high frequency with which they are given warnings about socio-political and environmental calamities. One particular client, who Mack referred to simply as Jerry, was given both types of warnings. Among the many encounters Jerry had throughout her life, she was once taken to the top of a large structure by taller, more human-looking, fair-skinned blonde beings, where she was shown scenes of missiles and other weapons. Remarkably, unlike many abductees who have their memories of an abduction erased, Jerry was assured that she would never forget what they revealed to her on that occasion. Keep that in mind, the memory erasing, the, what's it called? Screen memories, the UFO, amnesia that people experience. We'll circle back to that later in the presentation. So in the context of origins and how this time variable might help explain how it could be both, interstellar travel, again, probably not an issue as far as actually going between star systems within this galaxy. I think we could all agree it's not likely they're coming from other galaxies simply because there is too much space between galaxies. That may be unobtainable. However, within this galaxy, it might be possible to cover those vast distances. But it's important to recognize that when we're talking about interstellar travel, we're not just talking about that distance purely in space. We also have to consider time and how time passes differently relative to the observer in these different reference frames. So a good way of conceptualizing this is the twin paradox, which isn't actually a paradox at all. We throw paradox on anything that has anything to do with time, which is our failing, because there actually aren't paradoxes in the context of how these things work, especially with backward time travel when conceptualized in the context of the block universe model, which I'll talk about later as well. But with regard to the twin, whatever we want to call it, I probably should have thought of another word other than paradox before I launched into that rant. The twin thing, where you have two twins that are the same age, as twins obviously are. One of them gets into a rocket ship that's traveling at high speed throughout space, at some fraction of the speed of light. When they return, they find that because time is compressed within that rocket as they're moving rapidly at near speed of light, when they return, time and space are compressed, so they exit that spacecraft and they are relatively much younger than their twin with whom they had just shared the same age. because everyone back on Earth ages faster relative to those individuals traveling at high speeds. Very basic special relativity. Einstein pointed this out in the 1910s. So if we look at this in the context of actual numbers, Skip Newhall, a well-known astronomer, worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, PhD in applied mathematics from Caltech, crunched some numbers and just how different time would pass for individuals in that rocket ship versus those who stay behind on Earth. So again, if we're talking about extraterrestrial beings, or even us becoming extraterrestrials ourselves, which we've already done with our robots traveling to Mars, how might that look for returning not just to your home planet, but also your home time? So if you're traveling at near the speed of light to the galactic center, 11.2 years would pass. So not a big deal, kind of a long time. Might want to pack some sandwiches and stuff, but you would definitely be able to make it there in your lifetime. If you go to the other edge of the galaxy, just double that, 22.4 years. But the problem is that when you return home from this trip that took 40 years, 102,000 years passed for everyone back on Earth. And that is a huge difference. I mean, even to get up to that speed of light, you're not going to be traveling at the speed of light instantly because of the g-forces that would be involved in that and the acceleration process. But even accelerating, decelerating, taking that into account, average speed of close to the speed of light, it's a very big number. So we have to consider that in the context of time, because we may need time travel in order to achieve interstellar travel. It would be really hard to recruit astronauts that are willing to travel 11 years, sure. There's probably a lot of people that would be willing to do that. However, if you return home after 22 years and everyone else is dead that you ever knew, your children grew up and died, their descendants grew up and died, your society is completely unrecognizable, it might be difficult to recruit people to go on that mission. So in order to make interstellar travel feasible, we might also have to invent or figure out backward time travel so that we don't just get home to our planet, we also get home to our own time. So going a little bit further with this time aspect, it's also very possible that we do become extraterrestrial. We do inhabit Mars. We do inhabit planets, habitable planets around other suns and other star systems. And if that is the case, then we might get to the point where we don't really think of ourselves as earthlings anymore. We don't think of ourselves as having an origin on this planet in the same way that when someone asks where you're from, even if your ancestors are from China or Zimbabwe or Russia, wherever, if you've lived here long enough, you would say you're American or you're from Phoenix, depending on who's asking and where. So it could be the same thing where eventually in the future, we're talking about individuals, civilizations that had an earthly origin who have been on these planets for so long, they have backward time travel technology, they come back to Earth and they say, oh, I'm from this planet, even if they did have a very distant origin point on this particular planet that we all call home right now. So it's something to keep in mind. I'm not saying that it explains extraterrestrials by any means. It could be a very separate evolution on a different planet, but it is something to keep in mind because we do that same thing now. When we're asked where we're from, we say where we're from now, not where our ancestors are from. There's a different question that we ask if we're interested in that information. What's your ancestry? So if we can exclude the extraterrestrial hypothesis strictly as a model that says there is a separate evolution on a separate planet. Again, it's not likely we would end up with upright walking bipedal humans. There is the potential for convergent evolution, but it seems highly improbable on even one planet. But the fact that we have these potentially extraterrestrials saying they're Pleiadians or whatever the different groups are, I list them in my second book, it's almost a 0% probability that we would have the same evolutionary trajectory that's so rare here on this planet. Bipedalism, we're the only mammal that's habitually bipedal, that walks upright all the time. Other mammals will stand up for a short period of time. Chimpanzees will walk bipedally when they hoard food, but we're the only habitually upright walking mammals, and partly because of our gravity. We're a very small planet, 9.8 meters per second squared, and we still suffer from all kinds of problems with our hips, our knees, our backs, hemorrhoids, varicose veins. All of these are the result of gravity on a really small planet. I did some stats in my most recent book, redid the stats based on new numbers of Earth-like exoplanets. Only about 2 to 4% are the same size or smaller than Earth. We have a lot of seemingly habitable planets, but they're huge. They're super Earths, as we call them. So if it's really difficult to walk upright on this planet, if we're talking about beings coming from other planets, we wouldn't expect them to be bipedal. They'd be built more like tanks with 6 to 8 legs, according to Bill Sellers, who is a biomechanist. But if we exclude this as a possibility, or at least separate it, we don't have to exclude it, because I do think extraterrestrial should still be on the table, but then we're left with all of these other things that Hal Puthoff mentioned in his paper, the other main models to explain the phenomenon. I don't know how you would say, ectopet, maybe. But if we call what remains sort of a separate thing, I do think if we interject time into this, it becomes possible to understand how you could have the jinn, how you could have the gypsies, the fairies, the crypto-terrestrials. I recently read Mactoni's book, Crypto-Terrestrials, and it boggled my mind, because it was almost, not only did I find we had a very oddly similar writing style, but he's saying almost the exact same thing I've been saying, but just without that mechanism of time. And I think if we conceptualize his model and ultra-terrestrials with this perception, again, I'm not saying I even subscribe to this or that we all should, I just wanted to put it out there and show kind of how we might be able to understand the who, what, when, where, why throughout human history, and all of the different ways that these beings, who may be the exact same beings coming back from the same times, who visit different periods, are perceived differently based on the technology and the understanding of people who exist in those times. And obviously, they're likely coming back from different times, and there's what I refer to as temporal ancestry that we can observe among them, where we have very human-looking forms, like in the Mike and Leo Dworshak case. You have the sort of East Asian-looking forms, you have the Nordics and things like that. That could be geographic variation, but it seems there's also temporal variation, that we also have ones coming back from tens of thousands of years in the future with the big round heads, the tiny faces, the slender bodies, telepathic abilities, a highly evolved consciousness, all of these things that we might expect to see in the very distant future. But even if we take just one group, say randomly from 10,000 years in the future, bring them back now, bring them back 10,000 years in our past, bring them back 20,000 years, 30,000 years, each of those groups that are visited, irregardless of their cultural variation, their geographic variation in that time, are going to conceptualize them and depict them differently. They may even develop origin myths, worldviews, religions, based on those interactions, because it's so mind-blowing, it's godlike to them. The ubiquity of intentional cranial modification, the cranial boarding, the fact that that exists in so many different cultures throughout 10, 20,000 year period, groups that didn't talk to each other, that didn't spread through the cultural mechanism of diffusion or migration, it was independent invention. But why would you have that unless they were all seeing the same thing and trying to make their children look more like these gods? I think that's another thing to consider, in addition to the geoglyphs, the petroglyphs, the cave paintings, and all of these other things that seem to capture what may be happening with these individuals, extraterrestrial, extratempestrial, or otherwise. So if we interject this time variable in the context of, obviously, the time travel model that Hal points out, and the jinn, the crypto-terrestrial, ultra-terrestrial, We have a long history and prehistory of this phenomenon. I just mentioned that. It's depicted in variable ways that they, as these others, are conceptualized and enumerated on the wall of a cave or a carving or the intentional cranial modification, whatever it may be. But then also a lot of events. Ezekiel's interaction was probably one of the most talked about, but a lot of other things that are described in the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, all of these different texts, just different origin myths and oral histories, written histories, music, in a number of different societies throughout the world seem to mirror what we're seeing now, but is described in a way that was the best they could do. Now we can look at Ezekiel's account with the wheels within wheels and the light and the embers burning, the humanoid forms. That's a UFO. That's the same thing we see, but now we can talk about silver discs, rotation, electromagnetic forces. They didn't have that ability 2,000 years ago, let alone 8,000, 20,000. So a lot of these stories, and Jacques Vallée has talked about this too in numerous writings, a number of his books, that it could just be this phenomenon interacting with the past. So I'm just trying to sort of look at it in the context of that time variable and how it may help explain many of these things that seemingly are just outside of our reach. Another interesting one is this legend of Atlantis. I heard Tom DeLonge recently in an interview say, yeah, Atlantis was real, which I thought was a bold statement, but who knows, maybe it was. But I started thinking about it too in the context of this thing I get asked about a lot, which is one of the few things that kind of pisses me off within this research, is this idea of a divergent civilization, one from our past that went underground and developed UFOs and advanced humanoid forms and advanced consciousness while living underground or in the bottom of the ocean or something. There's a couple big problems with that. One, there's no archaeological evidence to support that. The second is that the way culture works is it's compounding, it's cumulative. It builds on top of what came before. In fact, you can't invent your own culture. Even in saying that, say, screw you guys, I'm gonna go start my own culture over here. The words you use to tell them that came from that culture. Your belief system, everything that you're taking to start your own is going to still be what you came from. We always build on top of what came before. Simple always comes before complex. Because of that simple fact that culture evolves, people build on top of the knowledge that came before. It's an acceleration. We see that process accelerating at a tremendous speed. We have a new iPhone come out every 5 minutes anymore, it would seem. But you can't have complex come before simple without the aid of a time machine. And one of my favorite quotes by Igor Novikov, who the Novikov self-consistency principle is named after, said that in the presence of a time machine, the past, present, and future all become one. You can have a future cause and a past effect. It's difficult for us to wrap our heads around that because our experience is the opposite. We move from past to future. We have a past cause and a future effect. That's very conventional, easy to understand. But in the presence of a time machine, all of that goes out the window. So this, in my limited perception of all of this, may be the only way you could have something like an Atlantis or a breakaway civilization, where you do have future humans, where possibly, we did make the earth not so great for them to live in, and they want to go back to a time when everything is pristine and natural and beautiful. Why not set up shop on a beautiful island at a time that predates us inventing boats? If at that point we do, and we start to be to the point where we could discover them, blow it all up. Maybe, go back to your time. Maybe, live amongst us, which could help explain the crypto-terrestrial, the jinn aspects of this, where you have seemingly very modern, human-looking individuals who also possess that clairvoyance and telepathy and precognition and those things that we ascribe to what are arguably beings with a much more advanced consciousness. So I think in this particular context, if we interject that time variable, we can help check some boxes, not just with the time travel theory, but also with this crypto-terrestrial thing, with these beings walking among us that have these abilities, which do exist, and they are here, and they have been for likely a very long time. Not saying Atlantis was the origin point, but if we are going to take that myth seriously, and if we are going to talk about breakaway civilizations, the only way that could happen is if it was a civilization that came from complex back to simple. They leapfrogged back to that time and took the complex society that they had, that advanced civilization and technology that was the result of this long evolutionary change that led to that, and then leapfrogged, jumped back into the past. So things that people experience in interacting with these individuals, the ones that have the telepathy, the clairvoyance, the healing powers, there's a lot of evidence that even healing of the physical body is tied to energy and is tied to consciousness, for lack of a better word. If they do live among us, it would be possible to do that. You know, we think about the Greys. The Greys, that was one of the things, and the start of this lecture, I mentioned how I've had to evolve my own conceptualization of this. I overlooked a lot of important things in my first book. One of them was that I just focused on the Greys. It was a very limited worldview. I've tried to cover more ground in the second book and show just how many are actual humans, just like us, who speak vocally and have the same craniofacial forms, that eat food, that have bathrooms in their ships, all of the same things that we use on a daily basis. But I also didn't really focus on disease transmission, the role of AI, robotics, the G-forces, how those can be explained with different temporal reference frames within and outside of the craft. But another one is this hybridization program. You know, focusing on the Greys, I think, is important for making that case in a long-term evolutionary sense. However, what about these human-looking forms? Are they just humans from our very proximate future where we start to do time travel earlier than I thought? I think that is the case, to be honest. I think we'll probably be doing this in the next 50 to 100 years, maybe sooner. At that point, we will be the ones that they see. Depending on how far back we go, we'll look exactly like them, or we'll look completely different if we go back tens of thousands of years into the past. But what if we used hybridization technology to make people from the future, say they are Greys, but they want to put some people here in this time, or 100 years ago, or 2,000 years ago? It'd be very easy to do that through even just hybridization. I assume by the time they're doing that, there's probably genetic modification. We have that technology now. It's only going to get better. But if you took a Grey, let's go extreme with this. If you took a Grey alien form with the globular neurocranium and the reduced and retracted mid and lower facial anatomy, hybridize them with someone from 30,000 years in our past, you might get somebody that looks like someone from this time, but retains those cognitive abilities, that advanced consciousness, and all of the things that come with it. So, again, I'm not trying to just throw time at everything and take this broad paintbrush, but if we do start thinking about some of these nuanced aspects of the phenomenon and do interject time, I think it's important to have that conversation. I also think it's important to listen to our bodies when it comes to bodily functions, thirst, excretion of liquids. So I put a little break in here. I have no idea if it was timed accurately or not, because I'm really bad at perceiving time despite studying it and talking about it. But this does seem like a good time to take a little break. So I believe it's a 15-minute break, and I'll meet you back here then.